is a crazy medical fact that most people don't know about. Story 1. Weight loss surgery cures diabetes. I'm talking about type 2, diabetes. Diabetes. And not from the weight loss, it happens almost immediately. Somehow it perturbs the gut flora, and that's what causes diabetes maybe. The Nobel Prize in 2006 was given to a research doctor theorized it was bacteria, not stomach acid and stress that caused ulcers. Unable to get funding for research, he drank an H. pylori milkshake and gave himself ulcers. He was Australian because of course he was. Fecal transplants have been known to cure Crohn's disease, but have also been found to transmit clinical depression from donor to recipient. All this is to say, we don't know alles about the gut. Story 2. A defibrillator actually stops your heart. It's up to your body to restart things correctly. The equivalent of the IT guy asking if you've tried turning it off and on again. Story 3. Endometriosis, tissue from the womb, is not cancer. But it can send out cells that spread through your internal organs and grow, stick your guts together or block them, deform your organs and eat holes through them, and spread up to your diaphragm and lungs. Unsurprisingly, this is agonizingly painful. Something like 1 in 10 women have it, and apparently it's still not worth doing research into. Story 4. When you get a kidney transplant, they don't take out your original kidneys, so you have 3 kidneys after a transplant. Also, they transplant the new kidney into your abdomen and it sits on top of your pelvis hip area. If you get multiple transplants, they just keep adding new kidneys in. I've known of patients who've had 6 kidneys. I learned a lot about this during my kidney transplant 6 years ago. Story 5. It's impressively hard to close someone's eyes after they die. Not like on TV. You press them down, and then they open back up a little. Then you have to press them closed again and press a little harder. I know. I was bedside when my dad passed away. If he was still in the room, I bet he had a good chuckle. Miss him. Story 6. There are so many wild things living in the microbiome of a human's skin. Demodex are a great example. Little mites that live near human hair follicles. They look horrific, and they feed off of sebum, sweat, dead skin, etc. Many things are localized too. The things living in your eyelash follicles are not the same as the ones living on your elbows. We're a whole universe, and even our skin is colonized by bizarre little fuckers. Story 7. Everyone knows that if you feel a lump in your breast, you gotta get that checked out. But there are actually... The SFW image on this site, an entirely woman-run nonprofit, literally saved my life. My doc did a physical exam, didn't feel a lump, and tried to send me packing, dismissing the weird, allergic reaction-looking patch of skin on my chest. Any change in your chest, dimples, dents, skin texture, itching, dry skin, anything, run it by your doctor and trust your gut. In my year of treatment and monthly checkups for the last few years, I always make a point to ask one nurse or doctor if they know there are 12 symptoms, and they don't know. Point being, not that docs. There's a lot to learn. Women's health is secondary in med school, etc. But that you have to dial in and fight for yourself. Story 8. Situs inversus, a congenital condition in which the major visceral organs are reversed or mirrored from their normal positions. Which I only learned about when reading about Catherine O'Hara, Home Alone, Schitt's Creek. Apparently her organs like heart, lungs, etc. are flipped to the opposite sides of her body. Story 9. Your immune system can just decide to attack whatever. It can decide that your hair follicles are a deadly threat and make you bald. It can go after your spinal cord and make it so your legs feel like they're on fire, 24/7. It can attack your organs and cause damage severe enough to necessitate a transplant. It can eat holes in your brain. It can tear up your joints. You can even wake up blind because your eyes were on your immune system's hit list for today. I think people are aware of autoimmune conditions, but I think most people don't think about how much can go wrong. Story 10. Maybe not that commonly unknown, but in movies and TV medical emergencies, you always hear the doctor or medics yell, "He's flatlining, get the paddles," and then proceed to shock the patient. You actually do not shock flatline. You shock fibrillations. Heart is beating but not pumping blood because it's a chaotic rhythm. You actually shock the heart to flatline. It's the human equivalent of turning you off and back on again. This is a very simplified description, but you probably don't want the crazy explanation with all the exceptions to the rules and such. Story. 11 things I learned from my doctors and my own reading. after I found out I was having twins. 1. At age 35, a woman's odds of having a multiples pregnancy drastically increases, and it continues to increase each year. This is due to your body's response to preparing for menopause by releasing more than one egg at a time. The older you are when you get pregnant, premenopause, the more likely you could have a multiples pregnancy. 2. You are likely to be the most fertile right before you begin menopause. Ever hear of a change of life baby? 3. If you already have had a multiples pregnancy, your odds of another one greatly increases. 4. People frequently ask, do twins run in your family? Fraternal twins, two fertilized eggs, are the only genetic twins. Women get the gene to release more than one egg through their mother and her mother and her mother. Identical twins, one egg that splits, is random nature and can happen at any time. 5. African American women are the most likely to have twins over any other race. Caucasian women over 35 have the highest rates of triplet or more pregnancies. In the USA, 6. If you have a higher BMI, 30 plus, you're more likely to have a multiples pregnancy. Story 12. Your gut bacteria plays a big part in your overall wellness and affects your mental health even. Your depression may or may not be, in some part, caused by lacking a certain bacteria or the presence of another. Story 13. CPR was intended to treat younger people whose hearts had stopped due to trauma. It was not intended to be used on 85-year-olds with multiple disease processes. Story 14. I had a total thyroidectomy last year due to thyroid cancer. I learned that, in rare cases, your body can regrow thyroid tissue, maybe healthy, functioning, maybe not, from the very small number of thyroid cells left behind. It's the reason thyroid cancer patients need to be on a high dose of replacement hormone to suppress the production of thyroid-stimulating hormone that could trigger regrowth. It was wild to learn that removing the gland doesn't always solve the issue. Story 15. Newborn girls can have a period, and both newborn boys and girls can lactate. 95% of URIs that kids get are viruses, no antibiotics needed. You cannot get the flu from the flu shot. You can feel a little shitty, but if you have URI symptoms after the flu shot, you just have a cold. Story 16. The mold from which the first antibiotics were harvested were first discovered from a young French med student, Ernest Duchenne, noticing that Arab stable boys would keep horse saddles in damp, dark places to encourage mold growth. This reduced the amount and severity of saddle sores. Wrote a paper on it but didn't receive credit. Several decades later, and Fleming makes penicillin. Story 17. If you take a medication, it will kick in fastest if you are lying down on your right side. A recent study found this out. They had assumed that standing would be the best position, but they found out the stomach works better lying down on your right side. Story 18. Humans can live with one lung, the remaining one will expand and partially fill the rest of the chest cavity, which can lead to cardiac distress. It's not the most pleasant existence, but people have made it up to 30 years like that. Story 19. During the COVID outbreak, when the mask versus anti-maskers clashed, a similar situation happened during the Spanish flu outbreak during WWI. There were as many people in government pushing for masks and vaccines, a proto-version of what we have, as many were against it. It didn't help that both sides of WWI lied, modified their numbers so that their opponents wouldn't see as weakness, exploit it. The only country that was open of its numbers was Spain, as it was fighting a civil war. Due to Spain accurately reporting its numbers, both sides of WYOS pinned the blame of the flu on Spain as their numbers were reportedly larger than the other countries. Cause war. Thus, obviously, the flu had to have originated from there. Most don't know it originated from the United States. Story 20. Pregnancy can just turn on diseases that you may have never had before. I developed a thyroid disease and an autoimmune disease during my first pregnancy. It's been great. Story 21. Your kidneys filter your pee from your blood, not from the digestion system. And your heart generates its own electric pulse that it uses to contract the muscle tissue to pump your blood. Story 22. I have a fun, rare condition called dextrocardia. It means that my heart is on the right side of my chest, instead of the left per usual. Sometimes this can be a more complicated condition where other organs are switched. But for me, it's just my heart. For me, it doesn't cause any major issues. But if involved other organs, it could create complications. So yay for me? I like to say that my heart is always in the right place. Story 23. Breast cancer treatment hasn't significantly improved from a mortality and morbidity point of view in the last decade. Despite this, it overwhelmingly gets more funding than other deadlier and similarly common types of cancer, e.g. bowel cancer. Story 24. Pteroramas, tumors, can contain hair, teeth, and even structures from organs such as eyeballs, nipples, fingernails, and toenails. Pteroramas most often grow in the ovaries and testicles. Edit. I don't know why my autocorrect misspelled teratoma twice. Story 25. Did you know that your body can randomly develop allergies to things you've never reacted to before? It's like a surprise party from your immune system, but not the fun kind. Happened to me with bananas of all things. Always keep an eye out for unexpected reactions. Story 26. Emergency departments are meant for emergency conditions, not for minor inconveniences or work notes. It's easier to see a PCP if you have an established PCP, so make an appointment for a checkup when you're well. Edit. I'm not even talking about medical problems that could be handled by a PCP, but come to the ED instead. My big gripe is when people come in with issues that no function adult would take to a doctor at all. A cold, a paper cut, a bug bite, runny nose. Story 27. If you have an allogenic bone marrow transplant, your blood type will change to the donor's and your bone marrow, and blood will contain the donor's DNA. For example, if you are a male and your donor is a female, and you do a blood DNA test, your results will show that you are a female. Since the rest of your cellular structure is your own, a DNA mouth swab test would show you are a male. This is known as chimerism. Story 28. Your nerves conduct electrical signals at over 50 mmHg when healthy. Over 100 mm if you prefer freedom units. It's a very complicated process of ions moving across cell membranes to propagate a signal from one spot to another, yet happens so fast. Nerves are cool. Story 29. If we were built to actually digest them, we could get our daily 2,000 calories by eating the full mouth sets of teeth from 55 adult humans. Crunch crunch. Story 30. I think we take for granted that we're constantly teetering on the edge of not surviving. You have a few minutes of oxygen in your body. Your life up to now has required hundreds of thousands of hours of routine heart beating and breathing to not die. It's not something you can be good at just 99% of the time. Your brain is the most complex thing in the known universe, but it still is only a few minutes away from death if it doesn't get oxygen. Right now, take a deep breath in and feel your heartbeat. If either stopped happening, that clock starts ticking, and it's all over. The pituitary is cool and has some neat tricks up its sleeve, your gut and microbiome are crazy, but that's all irrelevant if your brain misses out on a few minutes of oxygen. We can make iPhones and stream live video from the space station, but all of us have a countdown timer that could start at any second. That system is so simple and elegant, but also so terrifying. Story 31. According to a 2016 study by Johns Hopkins Medicine, medical errors are the third leading cause of death in the United States, killing over 250,000 people each year. Story 32. A lot of bone breaks don't hurt that much. I work in radiology, and while we don't see the nasty breaks you do in trauma, which often really hurt, we see a lot of broken toes, fingers, metacarpals, and metatarsals. Those breaks are often not easy to distinguish from muscle or tendon strain without imaging, and the patient is acting completely normal. I used to think breaking anything would have someone on the floor in agony, but a lot of them are like, yeah, it hurts when I bend it. If you want nightmare fuel, sometimes your spine can spontaneously break under its own weight. This is called a compression fracture. Story 33. Something around 2% of the world's population hears the hum. Those excessively loud and thumping sound systems in cars can be borderline torturous. Enjoy the rabbit hole. Story 34. Erectile dysfunction can be a precursor to heart disease. The penile arteries are only slightly smaller than the coronary arteries. Once they start blocking up causing ED, the coronaries are soon to follow. Approx 2 years. Story 35. Roughly half of the world's population is iron deficient, of whom about half have iron deficiency anemia. Iron affects literally every part of your body, from how cold your feet are to whether you exhibit symptoms of bipolar disorder. Seriously consider looking into it if you have any unexplained symptoms. If you have restless leg syndrome, get a blood test for ferritin now. A level of 100 is recommended, but doctors will sometimes say that as little as 40 is fine. Edit, which the published sources I've encountered disagree with. In any case, there's no harm increasing your ferritin to 100. Story 36. Taking antibiotics can cause psychiatric symptoms. It's not common, but it's not rare either. If you are taking antibiotics and experience derealization, depersonalization, you need to stop immediately. The cause of this is not well understood, but it's generally thought to be something to do with serotonin. Gut microbes modulate about 60% of your serotonin so that you can use it, and antibiotics disrupt your microbiome severely. Curiously, patients with pre-existing psychiatric symptoms sometimes see improvement when they take antibiotics. Source: ex-microbiologist who researched gut flora for years. Also, a lot of people in this thread are talking about fecal transplants, and I want to mention that those transplants are not easy. You have to nuke the existing biome to establish the transplant, which is very hard to do and very hard on the body. A lot of those transplants don't take, and even if they do, the body can revert back to its old microbiome and associated conditions due to the recipient's diet and location. Microbiomes do not exist in a vacuum. What you eat, where you live, who you hang out with, all of this influences what kind of microbes live inside you. So the fecal transplant, while promising, is still very much in its research phase and should not be thought of as some kind of simple miracle cure. Story 37. Prion diseases. Basically, a protein, which is the basic building block for your body, goes rogue. This leads to a chain reaction where other proteins around it are misshaped and basic body functions break down. When it attacks the brain, it causes irreversible brain damage and death. There's no way to target a rogue protein. In diseases like mad cow disease, it's acquired by consuming meat. But it can also just happen randomly. Story 38. Many doctors don't believe that fibromyalgia, POTS, chronic fatigue, or chronic Lyme disease are real. Or should I say that most doctors know the patient's symptoms are real, but believe the symptoms have psychological origin rather than a physiological. Story 39. Cancer vaccine has been in the works by Moderna and BNT. They have in fact been working on them when they took a detour to make COVID vaccines and made a ton of money. Their results in 2023 were surprisingly good. Great hopes for cancer treatment in the near future. Story 40. In the mental health world, when someone becomes mentally sick, their ability to recognize them becoming ill is taken away. It's called prodromal. It's really sad to see this happen to the people you love, how they change and not know it's happening. Oh. Story 41. That tumor markers in your blood work are no good for detecting some cancers, notably bowel cancer. Schedule a routine colonoscopy and listen to your body for symptoms. I received blood results that said no tumor markers, but then gave my doc a symptom list that had him send me for an immediate colonoscopy. I had stage 3 cancer. So as it happens medically, some tumors do not show up in bloods. Listen to the body. Or better yet, once you hit 40, schedule a routine colonoscopy, as sometimes it's symptomless until it's way too late. Story 42. All mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae. Giraffes have the same as humans, they're just huge. The only mammals that don't are manatees and sloths. Story 43. Even though there's several tests to evaluate lung function capacity, there is apparently also a cell found in your blood that indicates you have asthma. Source: my doc after 2 hours of lung testing. Story 44. You can end up with too much or too little cerebral spinal fluid. And it's really hard for doctors to figure out that something's wrong with your CSF because it doesn't really show up on standard CTs or MRIs. And it's rare enough that most neuros don't think of it as a first-line issue. They also add it and use outdated or bad information in their diagnosis. Having optic nerve damage is a sign CSF pressure is high, but not having optic nerve damage doesn't mean you're fine. It's unfortunately a common mistake, and there's potentially a lot of people misdiagnosed with chronic migraine who actually have a cerebral spinal fluid issue. The only actual test is a lumbar puncture to get the real pressure inside your head. Story 45. The human body is ridiculously efficient. You live, day to day, off of roughly 2,000 calories, even less if you've stored up enough fat. Animals of equivalent mass to us regularly 10,000. One of the biggest reasons why Neanderthals died out was simply because they required about 10,000 or more calories daily just to be alive while humans were far more efficient. Story 46. Possibly been noted before, but humans are naturally covered in cool stripes, mostly across the back. They are unique to each human. They are not visible under our visual spectrum, but certain other animals can see them. It's a shame we can't, because I think they look awesome. Story 47. There's a medical condition called stone man syndrome, where your muscles and tissues slowly turn to bone. Your body basically starts building an extra skeleton inside you, and there's no cure. It's rare, but terrifying. Story 48. The ethical and moral dilemma of using otherwise unobtainable data from Nazi experimentation. Story 49. CPR is only successful around 20% of the time in a hospital. The odds are much worse outside a hospital. I have done a lot of CPR and very few of those people are alive right now. Story 50. A nurse from ER once told me that you shouldn't pee standing up in the middle of the night if you just woke up. The release of the pressure in the bladder can make you feel lightheaded or even make you fall unconscious. He said there are many cases of this happening to old people and many times they hit their heads while falling and even die from this. Story 51. The tongue isn't a muscle, it's a combination of 8 muscles. The tongue is also not the strongest muscle, it's the masseter, known for giving us bite force of around 2,500 pounds. Bet you didn't know that. Story 52. When I hear people say ectopic pregnancies aren't abortion, I can't help but think, you're absolutely right. Those are two different things. An ectopic pregnancy can only be ended with an EUX surgical or abortion. Congrats on being accidentally correct. Edit. Strike through surgical. Folks, I actually learned something here. Thank you. Story 53. There are health conditions and medicines that cause people to gain weight. I'm tired of people telling me to move more and eat less. I already work out for 2 hours 5 days a week. My stomach is so fucked up that I barely ever feel like eating, and usually it takes one saltine to fill me up. I'm lacking in almost everything because my body can't properly digest food. I'm surprised that my doctor hasn't prescribed me alone despite my labs showing a deficiency in almost everything. Story 54. A death body sometimes release a burping noise from their mouth due to gas. In this state, they also start releasing pee, and so you can go into the morgue and start hearing a slow and loud Story 55. The modern world is far too loud. More and more people are developing permanent catastrophic tinnitus, ringing in the ears. There's a startling increase of cases in young people, probably because everyone wears headphones permanently these days. It's not uncommon to develop a mild form of tinnitus in old age. That can usually be tuned out or is otherwise mildly annoying. Unfortunately, people misunderstand that this describes all tinnitus. When I say catastrophic, I mean a jet engine wouldn't drown it out. The sounds people hear range from the typical flashbang noise to clicking typewriter noises to anything in between. It can also cause related issues like a thing called tonic tensor tympani syndrome, where your eardrum just randomly flutters for no reason. We have no idea why this happens. You have it for life. There is no cure. It cannot be treated. People kill themselves because of it. What's even weirder is that it isn't always hearing related. You can just wake up one morning with it despite having perfect hearing. Ultimately, it's a dysfunction in your brain similar to epilepsy. Story 56. I was one of the first people at a bad motorcycle accident, and the dude was out cold, but had a hard-on bulging through his sweatpants. When the sheriff showed up and checking on him, one sheriff deputies started playing with his and making jokes while they were waiting for the paramedics. I lost a lot of my respect for law enforcement that day. Story 57. I have several, but I'll just drop one. Nobody likes a know-it-all. Anyway, PPL over 60, male or female. If they are diagnosed with a UTI, then there's an 85% chance that they will develop a change in mental status. They will be confused, not know where that are at or who they are. Under 60? Just a normal urinary infection. Over 60? The UTI wrecks everything. If you have an elderly loved one who becomes confused out of nowhere, take them to the ER and tell the triage RN that you suspect a UTI, chances are they have one. Story 58. Doubtful many will see this, but birth control hormones vary. I was on a typical birth control pill for 10 years. Originally for depression, but it kept getting worse and worse. Did research into PMDD and turns out that there's birth control with other types of hormones, estradiol, for example. Anyways, once I switched to a specific birth control pill that had progesterone, suddenly I no longer have severe PMDD. My life has changed immeasurably for the better, all because of one specific hormone. Story 59. I have two. 1. Men can get breast cancer. It's far less common than in women because they have less breast tissue, but it does happen. So men, if you find a lump on your chest, please get it checked out. 2. There's a condition called familial adenomatous polyposis where you grow thousands of colon polyps at a very early age. Polyps are what lead to cancer, so people with this condition are almost guaranteed to develop cancer by their 40s. The polyps are basically everywhere, and they can even end up in the small intestine and stomach. The treatment? Removal of the entire colon and rectum. So please, get your colonoscopies regularly. If this is found early enough in one patient, it allows their family members to be screened even younger. And even without crazy genetic disorders, it's still important to catch colon cancer early. Story 60. The recommended screening test for cervical cancer is no longer Pap smear, it's HPV test, in which you can take the sample on your own. Yet, I am seeing many healthcare professionals still reluctant to share this to their patients and still subject them to Pap smear. Story 61. Not all people who drown actually aspirate water into their lungs. About 10 to 15% of drowning patients experience spasms of the larynx, preventing the entry of water, referred to as a dry drowning. Patients that do aspirate water usually only breathe in a small amount as well. Thus, performing abdominal thrusts is not recommended for drowning patients, as it can lead to vomiting and aspiration of vomit. Mistovich. Pre-Hospital Emergency Care, 12th ed., PG 904. Story 62. If you go into the emergency room for alcohol withdrawal, they will immediately rush you into the back as if you were suffering from a life-threatening gunshot wound or a heart attack. Story 63. The story of rapamycin. Look up the Radiolab podcast on it. True miracle drug, from the most remote place on Earth, almost lost forever. Some think we might all be taking it eventually. Story 64. Metal body implants usually survive the cremation process. If your loved one has a hip replacement or permanent metal screws or rods in their body for whatever reason, those metal parts will be left over because the cremation temperature doesn't get hot enough to melt them. As a family member, you can sometimes ask to get those pieces back after cremation, but if you don't, they're usually separated from the ashes and just recycled as normal scrap metal. Story 65. Brain hemorrhages can happen to anyone, at any time, at any age. That's what killed Grant Imahara from Mythbusters. He was only 50 and had no health issues of any kind. Story 66. About 1 in 10 patients who go into hospital experience some sort of accidental harm. Falling badly, given the wrong drug, sewed up with things still inside them, central line infection, etc., etc. The sooner you can get out of hospital, the better. Story 67. One fascinating and lesser-known fact about vaccines is the story of the vaccine necklace. In the early 20th century, Albert Sabin, the scientist behind the oral polio vaccine, worked to make immunization widely accessible. The oral vaccine was delivered on sugar cubes, but in some regions, it was stored in small glass ampules that could be strung together like a necklace. This vaccine necklace was not only a practical way for healthcare workers to carry doses into remote areas, but also served as a striking symbol of the global effort to eradicate polio. The necklace helped make vaccination campaigns easier to implement in resource-limited areas, eventually contributing to the near eradication of the disease worldwide. It's a quirky yet powerful reminder of how science and creativity come together to save lives. Story 68. Why is it when you stub your toe, you find yourself reaching to put pressure on it to help the pain? Pain is a relatively slow nerve conduction pathway compared to sensations like touch, proprioception. So these signals reach the brain first and help cloud the pain messages. Story 69. Not everybody goes through puberty, Kalman syndrome, and hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. Basically, the brain forgets to tell the rest of the body to start puberty. Not the same thing as being a late bloomer, though. Story 70. If you lose weight, if you are overweight, even with the crappiest foods, your biomarkers will improve. There was a doctor who lost weight eating only Twinkies, nothing else, and every biomarker of him showed improvement, including his insulin. Story 71. Despite the importance and widespread usage of general anesthetics, we don't fully understand the mechanisms by which they affect consciousness, memory, mobility, etc. Story 72. Endometrial tissue has been found on every organ of the body, including the brain, eye, and spleen. Endometriosis is much more than most people are taught, if they're taught about it at all. Story 73. Tobacco smoke used to be considered a cure for all sorts of conditions. Typically, a bellows was used to up the smoke, then a nozzle was inserted in the rectum and smoke was blown in. This was 1700s time frame, I think. Story 74. Your brain can herniate out of your skull and put pressure on your brainstem and other structures while it's trying to escape. It's called Chiari malformation, and the majority of the medical world is pretty ill-informed about it. Story 75. Everyone has a small blind spot, also called the scotoma, in the center of their pupil. The blind spot is where the optic nerve and blood vessels leave the eyeball. Our brains interpret the imagery surrounding the blind spot in order to fill in the missing information and make the field of view contiguous. Additional fun fact, there are small mites, also known as demodex mites, that are microscopic arachnids that live in the hair follicles of the eyelashes and eyebrows on humans and nowhere else on Earth. Story 76. If you're doing surgery on someone and you take their intestines out, you don't have to worry about putting them back in the right place because the intestines will do that for you. They'll wriggle back into position when you put them in. Story 77. There are a number of ways to stop seizures. One way is that someone can have an implant on their vagus nerve that works to prevent seizure by delivering regular electrical stimulation. The really cool part is that it can come with a magnet they or a caregiver wears on their wrist that when a seizure comes on, they can swipe it across their chest to deliver extra stimulation to quickly act to stop the seizure. Story 78. 1 to 2 per 100 people in the US are born intersex. People are born with all sorts of chromosomal variations, and we know that over 30 different intersex variations exist. People are born with these variations: IIE, Klinefelter syndrome, XXY. 1 in 500 males with an extra X chromosome. Turner syndrome, XY. Females with a missing or structurally altered X chromosome. XYY syndrome, Jacobs syndrome. 1 in 1,000 males with an extra Y chromosome. People with PCOS can experience intersex-like changes to their bodies. People can be born intersex and not know it. 1 in 2,000–4,000 babies are born with ambiguous external genitalia. Morris syndrome is now called 46XYDSD, androgen insensitivity syndrome. These people have an extremely high level of testosterone and other male hormones, but the testosterone does not affect the fetal cells that usually develop into male sexual organs because of a mutation in the androgen receptor gene. These people therefore have male chromosomes but are women socially and in external appearance. They do not have internal female sexual organs, and they form testicles that remain concealed in the abdominal cavity. This was written as a response to a relative claiming there's only male and female. Story 79. You know that tendon that shows up on your forearm near your wrist when you flex your hand upwards? Yeah, that's a muscle up to 20% of people do not have. It's technically a relic from evolution that isn't necessarily needed anymore, since we have so many more muscles that do the same thing. It can miss on only one side, or both. When we learned this in our anatomy class in med school, we even had exactly 20% of students who didn't have this muscle. Story 80. Your inner nose tissue is the same spongy tissue found in the penis that expands and contracts when filled with blood. Throughout the day, in order to keep your nose moist, one nostril will slightly swell to allow more airflow through the opposite nostril. It's not total occlusion, but it allows the nasal airway to stay more robust to incoming pathogens with an appropriate level of moisture to assist the nose hairs in catching things. TLDR, both men and women have alternating nose boners all day. Story 81. There can be phantom limb pain after penectomy. And also interestingly, this happens at a much lower rate to trans women after gender-affirming surgery. Story 82. There is a version of SIDS for adults called SADS. I had a cousin back in the early 90s, he was 25, and came home from his master's program to visit his parents. He was washing dishes and said, "I feel funny," and collapsed and was dead. Story 83. Alcohol is classified as a Group 1 carcinogen, similar to asbestos, radiation, and tobacco. Alcohol causes at least 7 types of cancer, including the most common ones, such as bowel cancer and female breast cancer. With that being said, alcohol is also a toxic, psychoactive, and dependence-producing substance. Story 84. Did you know that the human body contains enough fat to make 7 bars of soap? It's wild to think about. I guess we're all walking soap factories, lol. Not sure what that says about my diet, though. Story 85. The chemical that the body turns alcohol into, forgot its name, damages DNA, which means cells may grow back wrong and become cancer. There is no safe amount of alcohol. I'm not a doctor, so don't take my word for it. Look it up yourself. Story 86. You need to put your head forward if you're having a nosebleed. If you lean your head backwards, there's higher chance of you choking on your own blood. The bleeding is going to happen either way. Leaning your head backwards doesn't really help. Packing the nose up would help though, so would suggest that. Story 87. If you're pregnant and the mother's Rh type doesn't match the father's, so mom is O plus and dad is O, the mother's body will try to kill the fetus thinking it's an intruder. This is why Rh factor tests are one of the first prenatal labs to be done. You can get an injection called Rogam to stop that from happening. Story 88. Despite being relatively common, 97% of people with gluten-related autoimmune diseases remain undiagnosed for decades and are usually diagnosed only after developing serious complications like leukemia, diabetes, osteoporosis, or other disease. Story 89. The reason you are told not to eat before anesthesia is because there's a high chance you will vomit and then inhale, aspirate, that vomit. It's not because the nurses or doctors are mean, they don't want you to get pneumonia or expire. Story 90. Type 1 diabetes is a life sentence of misery with worse suffering than almost any disease, and nobody knows how serious it is, and the type 1 diabetic is not given enough empathy and faces much stigma from people equating it to type 2, even medical professionals. Story 91. Deep in our ear we have about 1,000 tiny stones, otoconia, made of calcium carbonate, that move around in a gelatinous layer and rub against tiny hairs to tell our brains we're moving. It's how we can sense acceleration, etc. If the stones get out of the normal gelatin area, you can feel all out of and have trouble keeping your balance. Story 92. That taking in food with too much sugar raises your glucose level too much, causing a light inflammation in the whole body. Long-term light inflammation, 10 plus years, can cause a whole plethora of ails. Most daily food we eat has way too much sugar to be healthy for us. Story 93. Rarely, endometrial glandular tissue can get displaced into the pleural space, and you can get a pneumothorax when you get your period. It's called catamenial pneumothorax. Story 94. A good amount of the information in current medical text was from data collected during human testing performed by the Japanese in Unit 731 and by the Germans in their Jewish camps. Story 95. If you're ever diagnosed with bicuspid heart valve, make sure they follow up and do an MRI and echocardiogram of your ascending aorta. There is a link between bicuspid valves and aortic aneurysms, and you don't want that to go undiagnosed. Source: was diagnosed with a bicuspid valve in 2017-18, discovered aortic aneurysm, had open heart surgery on end 2022 at the ripe age of 46 to replace the ascending aorta.